Chapter 9. The Mystical Holy Land. A deep feeling of reverence filled me as my plane touched down, and I saw the brilliant white flag with the blue Star of David waving in the desert sun. My arrival in the Holy Land felt like landing in sacred territory. Jonah and his wife Rachel, both Swiss and in their 60s, met my flight at the airport. Jonah was very active and well-preserved, and he retained a boyish type of charm in the way his uncombed white hair stood up from his head and his big square glasses sat on his face. His wife was not so active, but she was a woman of good health, with short curly hair and a kind demeanor. They had driven to Tel Aviv from their home, just outside the city on the beach of the Mediterranean Sea. They both welcomed me with heartfelt embraces, as if they were my closest relatives. I felt totally at home. They loaded my bags in their Jeep for me. As we drove southeast toward Jerusalem, Jonah asked me how my flight was. Pleasant, I told him. The 2.5 hours passed more quickly than I expected. I sat next to a French nun in her 70s, and we talked for most of the trip. I could tell by the habit she wore that she was an Ursuline nun. That order was common in Chile when I was growing up, and they were very active in the hospitals and service. She told me she was the head of the Ursuline order, and that after 55 years of service as an administrator, she was finally on her first trip to the Holy Land. Her duties apparently had made it impossible for her to make such a pilgrimage until now. She was inspired by my pilgrimages, and she told me about her vocation of spirit and service, and her love for the poor. She was a true vocational Christian, a wonderful human being. When I told her I discovered my purpose in life, she told me she had been overwhelmed by her service and her duties in the order, and that most of her life was spent in management. She was very, very happy that this was a time in her life when she could reconnect to the Holy Land as a source of inspiration, to the Jewish roots of the Christian tradition, and to the vocation of spirit. She sounds like a wonderful woman, Rachel smiled. She was fascinating. I told her about my travels and all I had learned, and she congratulated me. You were awakened fast, she told me. She said it had taken her most of her life to truly open to the life of the spirit. It sounds like you received much more during your 2-hour flight than mere passage to the Holy Land, Jonah mused. Knowing how much you like to talk with people, you will be happy to know that many Israelis speak English. You should get by okay if you decide to wander off by yourself, which I'm sure you will. You know me too well, my friend, I said, laughing. But I do know some Hebrew. How do you know Hebrew? Rachel asked. It's in my genes, I answered. I never would have guessed it, Rachel said in wonder as she examined my blonde hair and blue eyes. My grandfather in particular passed down to me the essence of the Hebrew tradition. However, I have spent the last few years studying other religious traditions. Anything you know of Hebrew will certainly make your stay here easier. Now, Jonah announced, spreading his arms, I promised you that when you came to this country, our home, you would also feel at home. You are our guest. The moment I knew you were coming, I arranged my schedule so that I could take you to our sacred places and give you a tour of the sacred geometry of the Holy Land. Oh, if it isn't too much trouble. No, Jonah responded. No trouble at all. It is my pleasure to show you around. Since it was nighttime when we reached Jonah's home, near the beach outside of Tel Aviv, we decided to go to bed early. I fell asleep on the cot in their living room that night, dreaming happily of all the people I would meet and all the sights I would see. But when I awakened in the morning, we did not immediately begin our exploration. We ate a leisurely breakfast, and then Rachel set about doing household chores, while Jonah sat down to read. I decided to take a walk around to the neighborhood, while the two of them got ready for the tour I was promised. I walked down to the beach, and as I lay down on the sand, I was filled by the spirit of what the Mediterranean was. I could see in my mind's eye the history of the land, of the Canaanites, of the Hebrews, of the Israelites, of the Jews, of the Philistines. I pulled up memories of biblical history and saw the invasions from foreign countries. I was totally overwhelmed by being in this holy land. Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, the monotheistic basis of our whole culture, was breathing in the stones and in the air of this wonderful place. I had not seen anything of the old city of Jerusalem, so I was still trying to imagine all I'd heard or read about Jerusalem: the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, the Dome of the Rock, the Wailing Wall. When I arrived home from my walk, Jonah asked me if I would mind having soup for lunch. I was rather anxious to get going and was a bit disappointed to learn we probably wouldn't start our tour until after we ate. Still, I thought our meal couldn't delay us any more than an hour. But after lunch, Jonah got up from the table and went back to his reading. "Aren't we going into the city today?" I asked. "Patience, Carlos," Jonah told me. "Relax today. You will see Jerusalem tomorrow." The next day, we loaded the Jeep with some supplies and records Jonah needed and drove off toward the old city just after 10 o'clock in the morning. He said he had an appointment in the morning, but he would show me the city in the afternoon. We turned off the highway onto an unpaved road. "Where are we going?" I asked carefully. "To Jerusalem," Jonah replied. "You just turned off the highway leading into the city, though." "This road also leads to the city. Remember to have patience, Carlos," the older man said with a bit more of his Swiss accent coming through. "Some things are worth waiting for." The road we took raised a plume of dust behind us that caught up to us when we stopped to let a man and his goats cross the road. We both coughed a bit. "I'm sorry about that," Jonah said, "but I want to have the top off the car when we approach the city." "What road is this?" "Have you heard of the road of King Solomon?" Jonah asked me. I nodded. "This is it. Some people call it King Solomon's Road, but it was really David's road when Samuel brought him to meet Saul as a young musician." The Bible was in front of me. The readings of my grandfather were coming out in every single edge of the landscape. After the goats had passed, we drove up a gradual hill beyond which I could see only the blue sky. As we neared the top of the hill, I glimpsed the top of a silver dome of pure energy. As we climbed higher, a golden dome seemed to sprout on top of the silver dome, and the rest of the city started coming into view. I looked up, and the sky was filled with clouds that looked like angels, or angels that were patrolling the clouds. I knew the city was an anchor point to the world. I remembered a song I'd learned as a child that went something like, "I saw Jerusalem of silver, and I saw Jerusalem of gold." Jonah stopped the Jeep at the top of the hill, and we got out and looked down on the city so many people had fought to possess. I felt the vortex of energy that this place represented, and I was overwhelmed. Tears streamed down my cheeks. Touched by strong emotions, I could fathom why there had been so many wars fought over this city. I sensed the sacred place was an anchor for the world. It was the navel of peace, as it had been described. The highway from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem, which is a brief but significant route, is more than a road. It is a road heavily annotated, a road turned scripture. First we passed a Trappist monastery, then a British garrison fort, still trim and intact. Then less pristine, a Crusader castle. Amid eucalyptus trees planted on a steep hillside by Jewish settlers in the last century, we saw more recent wreckage, burned-out tanks, rusted vehicles, and the skewed limbs of derelict artillery. They were not mere eyesores, but studied relics of the Israeli and Arab claims on Jerusalem. It was obvious We were nearing a dearly disputed place. It was only 10 years since Israel had won the Six-Day War in 1967. The harbingers of Jerusalem's hills were designed for a pilgrim's first visit, said Jonah. I nodded my head in agreement. If you arrive as I have with no more than a childhood-bred vision, Jerusalem is entirely gratifying. It's golden, I said. When we entered the city, Jonah left for his appointment, and I wandered through the city. As I was admiring the architecture of a government building, an old man approached me. He had a lined face and was bent over the cane with which he walked. You do not look like an ordinary tourist, the man said to me in English, though colored by the familiar sound of Hebrew. There is something about you that I sense as different. I am not really a tourist, I replied to the man. I am more of a pilgrim, though not of any one faith. I am here to experience for myself the spiritual energy that resides in Jerusalem. Then you will need a guide, the old man said with a smile. My name is Isaac, and I'm a bit of an amateur historian of the city. If you would like, I would show you the sights. You see, I, too, am a student of the spirit. I do not want to inconvenience you, I told Isaac, looking at his cane. I intended to walk through the city. That is not a problem for me, he said. This cane is just for company. All right, then. Lead on, my friend. Isaac's history lesson commenced. According to the history books, the British military government of the city in 1917 wanted a radiant focus for those descending from these hills. He must have heard the hymns of heavenly Jerusalem echoing in his mind when he decreed that all new buildings be constructed of stone minced from local quarries. Even the most brutal high-rise hotel is clad with this pink to amber stone. Well, you can see the effect. The city glows. We walked into Old Jerusalem, as the pilgrims traditionally do, through the Jaffa Gate. Inside an hour, I realized that the hymns I'd learned in my life had not properly prepared me. The topography of green hills and city walls was, not surprisingly, all wrong. Aesthetic sensibility was nowhere evident in the sort of gospel theme park that had been created there. A 19th century world in which, having run the gauntlet of hawkers to reach the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, there was no sanctuary. Calgary is a palace of gaudy altars, stone cisterns, and grottos, where the presence of 6 separate Christian factions simultaneously compete for the pilgrim customers. We suffered as 2 rival guides bartered their prices for the Via Dolorosa before we made our own sad way. Some dignity and loveliness were retained by the Mount of Olives, yet the verdict must be that Christian Jerusalem was not so much golden as brass. The Christian guides admitted the dome was an outstanding example of Islamic design. Together with the nearby Al-Aqsa Mosque, it offered a marvelous panorama where we went to pray and do our self-practice. We also prayed on Mount Zion itself a few minutes away. I saw how everything spiritual merged in this city, a holy place for Christians, Muslims, and Jews. Everybody wanted it to be theirs. I was awestruck. Carlos, do you know what makes a place sacred? Isaac asked me as we continued our walk through the city. There are probably as many answers to that question as there are people who think about it, I answered. That is true, but do you know that all seem in agreement on one point? The sacred in Jerusalem is manifest in meeting places between heaven and earth, where the divine touches and enters the human world. I've always heard life in the holy city described as being of a different nature and quality from the profane world surrounding it, I told Isaac. When Moses encountered the divine in the midst of the burning bush, he was told, "Put off thy shoes from thy feet, for the place whereon thou standest is holy ground." This was in the Bible. But what does this mean for us today? What does it mean when I arrive in the city and the divine now seems to hide its face, and all that remains of its presence are monuments commemorating the sites of former glories? I hope that the sacred is alive and still to be found. Look around us, Carlos, and tell me what you see. I see pilgrims and visitors much like myself. Yes, and they all come here with expectations that they bring to no other sacred place on earth. For Jerusalem is not just a city of the past. It is here that the divine presence has promised that it will one day renew its ties with men, bringing them eternal salvation and reestablishing God's kingdom on earth. Each person, consciously or unconsciously, is here seeking a confirmation of this promise. I had to admit that I was also so moved. Even the most rational part of me hoped to find here some indication that would bridge the gap between the outer material world and the world of the deep inner beliefs and hopes. I somehow secretly knew I was going to have, in this trip to the Holy Land, a real and new contact with another level of being. But where is God when I look around here in the city? I demanded of Isaac. I see monks hawking tombs of saints like a freak show. They remind me of the money changers Jesus threw out of the temple. It is true, Jerusalem is a place where the divine no longer lives openly, Isaac said, sighing. Theories behind the cause of this run the entire spectrum, from the excesses of religious emotion to the coldness of pure intellectual speculation. All contain the fragment of truth. But look at that woman there, he said, pointing to an elderly woman kneeling before the tomb of David. Do you doubt that she believes the divine is present? Watching the woman overcome with emotion, I could not doubt her sincerity. She certainly seems to feel the presence of God, but I am not completely surprised. She is praying at the tomb of David. And what if I told you this was not the real site of David's tomb, and the tradition here was Christian in origin? Would you then be forced to question the nature of the experience? The same is true of the places of devotion along the Via Dolorosa, which we know is not the real route taken by Jesus, nor the one commemorated in the first 11 centuries of Christianity. But do you doubt that woman is in touch with something holy? I looked again at the woman. There was no doubt in my mind that the spirit was in the air. It was in the stones. It was in the rocks. As Isaac and I walked through the city, I noted the way the buildings seemed to grow in all directions, often on top of or around each other. Some contend that sacred buildings and sites arise from the earth in places where vortexes of energy are especially strong, Isaac explained. It has been claimed that Jerusalem, especially the area of the Temple Mount, is such a vortex. While this may be true, and there may be people who are sensitive to that force, many visitors think of it as just a theory. A visitor may choose to believe in this theory intellectually, but it is far from the real context he seeks, which is faith. So what do you think, Carlos? Isaac asked. Do you see any order in all this chaos? Or do you just see a random sprouting of structures? I can see a vague underlying order, I admitted. Something in the way this building is in line with the one there and another further down that hill. But I can't really make much sense of it. The streets we are walking through right now, Isaac told me, are all on sacred ground. The construction of the sacred geometry of pyramids and stone circles and the orientation of certain churches and ancient temples have been shown to be intimately related to the recording of astrological phenomena. I know that the ancients were capable of measuring both the Earth's surface and the heavens with incredible accuracy, I commented. You know, in school I was taught that ancient cultures were primitive, but after my journeys with shamans, Sufis and Native Americans, I know that these cultures were very advanced in some ways, but I don't know if I understand how these buildings could represent the heavens and the earth and the rest of God's creation. These sites are believed to lie along a vertical line of descent, which connects the heavenly world above with the earthly world below, Isaac said. Consequently, they're centers for the divine manifesting itself in earthly form, and from which, under favorable conditions, its influence can spread outward to the profane world. The divine is seen as a well-defined world of order, while the profane is an endless ocean of chaos, Isaac continued. Modern physics demonstrates the organization of the profane as chaos theory. The form taken by the sacred, which is an earthly material reflection of the divine world above, manifests aspect of the heavenly order. The simplest of forms reflects the outer physical order of the heavens and are astronomical in nature. But there are others which reflect some aspects of the inner nature of the divine order of the universe. Jerusalem is a sacred place. The city's monuments consistently demonstrate the laws concerning man's relation to the cosmos, from his fall from grace to the inner spiritual evolution that leads to eventual salvation and return. What is remarkable is that no one building or sacred site in Jerusalem contains all this great knowledge. Rather, different places combined with certain of the city's traditions, legends, histories, religions. Jerusalem itself is a living being, as is our whole earth. Then tell me, Isaac, what is the sacred? Carlos, Jerusalem is a city with more than 100 names. Does that make any sense to you? It reminds me of the 100 names of Allah in the Sufi tradition, I told him. That's very good, Isaac continued. The rabbis of old claimed that the city had 70 names, which were equivalent in number to the names of God. I've done some research on the city, I said, and I know the Hebrew word for Jerusalem itself appears 656 times in the Old Testament in a singular form, Jerusalem, only 3 times in the plural. The earliest historical record is in an Egyptian text from the 18th or 19th century BC, where it is mentioned as a Canaanite city called Eshelmus. In the latter Kalalamana letters, it is called Rushalim, while in a Syrian inscription, it is called Hierosolima. The Greeks called it Jerusalem, holy. The Christians called it Jerusalem, and from that derives Jerusalem. Do you also know that it's considered the navel of the world? Asked Isaac. It is believed to be the place where Melchizedek, the king of Salem, the king of peace, was tithed to by Abraham, and this Melchizedek, without father or mother, without descendants, having neither the beginning of days nor the end of life, became the Son of God. The Jewish tradition established that it was a Shalom that Melchizedek founded an academy or school to instruct the people of the world in the ways of God. This picture of an immortal priest who rules the city of perfect peace and instructs the nations of the world is reminiscent of Isaiah's prophecy for the end of time, for the time I felt we were living now. And it shall come to pass in the last days that the mountain of the Lord's house shall be established on the top of the mountains and shall be exalted above the hills. Though it was many years before this knowledge became active in my consciousness, the seeds of the Melchizedek priesthood entered my heart at this time. The old man continued this tour of the city, telling me its history and legends. Yes, being in Jerusalem with the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, the Dome of the Rock, and the Wailing Wall was a rebirth for my spiritual journey. Eventually, I finished my walking tour with Isaac and said goodbye to this warm old man. I returned to the place Jonah had parked the Jeep, and he was waiting patiently for me. You just can't stand to wait around and do nothing, can you? Not when there's so much to see and so many people to meet, I said with a smile. Over the next 3 days, Jonah drove me into the old city each day and dropped me off so I could wander around, while he took care of his business with the Israeli government. When he wasn't busy, he walked with me. Sometimes we sat in small corner cafes in view of the Tower of David and the walls where I had walked. As I strolled the ancient streets, I felt transported to another time. Many times I saw myself in different past lives, wearing the same clothes as the people were wearing today, jalabas. It could have been anywhere from 500 to 2,000 years in the past. I couldn't tell for sure, but it definitely seemed a very long time ago. I went to the Wailing Wall with its many slips of prayer-inscribed paper sticking out of every conceivable crack and hole in the wall. I met some of the traditional Jews who were there praying, and I prayed with them. They told each other Hasidic teaching stories in Hebrew, just like the ones I had learned among the Islamic Sufis. The characters were almost exactly the same, and the outcome was always similar. I was again struck by the similarities between the world's spiritual traditions, knowing they must have all sprung from one root. I went to the tomb of King David, and as I stared at the monument, I felt my consciousness changing. There was something about this holy place that gave me a sense of completion. I felt I had somehow just integrated all the travels and teachings I had experienced in the previous 7 years and was ready to move on to the next phase of my life, but I had no idea what that was yet. Jonah volunteered to meet me at the Church of the Holy Sepulchre on the 3rd day. I have something I'd like to show you, he told me. At noon, I waited for Jonah at the huge entrance gates to the church, where the remains of Jesus were buried. Priests and monks tried to draw passers-by into the church in the style of carnival sideshow hawkers. I was approached several times in the few minutes I waited for Jonah to arrive. "There you are," Jonah said as he approached me and patted me on the shoulder. "I was waiting for you on the other side of the church. My apologies." We entered the huge gateway, which opened into an inner courtyard. Ahead of us, through crowds of tourists, lay a series of doorways and archways. The openings were covered with symbols and words in various languages. Beyond lay hallways and passages leading somewhere deeper into the church. As we walked to the right, we could see even more doorways, and at most of the passage entrances, priests and monks of various Christian sects, like those outside the church, were beckoning the crowds of tourists down their particular passage. Each of them claimed that their passage was the true entrance to the Holy Sepulchre. There were dozens and dozens of these entryways. We finally followed one of the passages into the tomb. Ornate lamps illuminated the shadowy corridor, enough to see various shrines set into the walls. The passageway eventually opened into a fairly large chamber, where all the passageways seemed to converge. We made our way through the throngs of other tourists to a roped-off area in the center of the chamber. There we saw a large flat stone surrounded by signs in over a dozen languages, describing this as the burial place of Jesus. Jonah must have seen the frustrated look on my face as I was jostled by other tourists and once again assaulted by the various proselytizers and mendicants. "It really is quite a sacred place," he said to me as he pulled me aside, "but it is difficult to appreciate here. Let me take you to a non-commercial part of the church." We took a different passage out of the chamber, a Greek Orthodox passage, I believe. In the courtyard, near the huge doors through which we had entered, Jonah pulled open a door and motioned for me to go through it. It was a dark, narrow stairway leading up. After climbing several flights, the stairway ended at a narrow hallway. At the end was a door around which bright sunlight shone. I stepped out onto what must have been the roof of the church. The city stretched for miles in all directions, and most of the buildings and streets looked hundreds, if not thousands, of years old. "Over here," Jonah said as he guided me toward the other end of the roof. There, in front of a cave-like shack, were 4 elderly bearded black men in robes and sandals. Each wore a large cross made of wood around his neck. None of them said a word, but they put their hands together and smiled at us as we approached. "Sit here," Jonah instructed, as he pointed to an area of the roof a few feet from the monks. My older companions sat down next to me on the roof, facing the 4 monks. They acknowledged our presence, but they did not approach us or speak to us. I felt myself relaxing and breathing more deeply and slowly. Over the next 90 minutes or so, I sat on the roof of this sacred building with Jonah and the monks, none of us saying a word. I looked out at the spectacular view and observed these simple, peaceful men living up here. I could feel my body becoming lighter. Joy and peace washed over me. I was so content. Nothing else in the world mattered. It was Jonah who got up finally and said, "I need to be getting back to work." I joined Jonah and followed him back down the steps into the church. He explained as we descended that these monks were from Ethiopia and that they lived on the roof of the Church of the Holy Sepulchre and prayed without uttering a word. Their order had occupied this unlikely spot for centuries. Over the following 2 weeks, Jonah and I went to various cities around the country during the day and returned to his home just outside Tel Aviv at night. One of the first stops we made after our time in Jerusalem was a kibbutz on the outskirts of Tel Aviv. Jonah was there to check on the honey production for the government. While I was waiting outside the kibbutz for Jonah to finish his business, I noticed groups of Israelis and Arabs milling around. I felt myself drifting into an altered state of consciousness. Just as I had on my first day in Jerusalem, I was transported back to a time centuries past. I wore the same long kaftan and sandals as before, but I saw more clearly now that I was a healer in this time, a faith healer. I cured the sick by invoking the power of God and directing it with a touch of my healing hands. I suddenly had the urge to shout out some Arabic prayers I learned in Morocco at the Sufi community. The people nearby stopped and looked at me with wonder. I then changed to some Hebrew prayers I had learned as a child. The onlookers became quieter and drew closer. Suddenly, I found myself uttering prayers in some language I had never heard before, and the crowd became silent. "Who are you?" a very old Israeli woman shouted. "I am a healer," I replied. "Can you stop the pain in my back?" another older Hebrew woman shouted. I stepped toward the woman and looked at the way she stood bent forward, with her shoulders almost touching the sides of her face. "If God wills it," I said. I stood behind the woman and placed my hands on her shoulders. I started chanting one of the Hebrew prayers again, and I started to feel my hands becoming warmer. The woman's shoulders started to drop and fall back. I moved my hands down to her lower back and touched it with my fingertips. "Refuah," the woman cried as she straightened her posture slightly. "The pain in my back is gone." I learned from one in the crowd that now surrounded this woman that she had not stood upright like that in over 10 years. Her cry of refuah meant that she believed the power of God working through me had alleviated her pain and stiffness. An older Arab man and his teenage son came up to me then. "Could you see if you could help my daughter?" the man said quietly. "She hasn't risen from her bed in weeks, and we fear she may be dying." I followed the man and his son to a fairly large house that lay 20 minutes by foot from the kibbutz. Once inside, the man took me into the bedroom of his daughter, a thin girl in her teens whose large brown eyes stared blankly across the room from her cot. I knelt on the floor next to her and placed my hand on her forehead, hot with fever. I moved my hand to the top of her head and began chanting one of the Arab zikrs Hassan had taught me. After a couple of minutes, the girl's eyes started to blink and scan about the room. I told her to sit up in bed, and she slowly worked her way up to her elbows and then to a sitting position. The man called for his wife to come see. When she arrived, their daughter was putting her feet on the floor and standing up. The mother ran up to her and embraced her. "Praise be to Allah," she cried. She felt the girl's forehead. "The fever has gone," she announced. The man looked at the now smiling face of his daughter and said to me, "I don't know how we can repay you for your help," he said, "but I have some fruit from our orchard I would like you to have." He left for a moment and brought back a burlap bag of oranges, grapefruit, and lemons. I accepted the bag, wished them much peace and joy, and left. I walked back toward the kibbutz, where there still was a dozen or more people there near the front gate. I set the bag down on the roadside and said, "I have a gift for you. Take as much as you like." Most of those nearby took several pieces of fruit each, but when I looked in the bag, there were still about 8 pieces left. "I will leave the bag here," I told them. "Please take the rest of the fruit before it spoils." And that was what I did at our other stops over those 2 weeks. Jonah would drive us to some city where he needed to check on the honey production. While he was off inspecting the bees, I wandered around performing other healings by laying on of hands. Whatever gifts I received, fruit, chocolate, wine, perfumes, I immediately distributed to the next people I met. In this way, we visited Capernaum, Tiberias, Zaphod, and settlements along the Sea of Galilee. We arrived at Capernaum on Friday night, and since we were unlikely to get back to Jerusalem before sundown, the couple Jonah worked with during the day insisted that the 2 of us stay with them during the Shabbat, the Jewish holy day. The Shabbat is a celebration of time more than space. For 6 days, people live under the tyranny of things of space. In Shabbat, we become one with the sacredness of time. Jewish faith is not a map outside of this world, but a way of living in the superconsciousness in this world. It is not rejecting or detaching from civilization, but going above civilization. Shabbat is the day that people learn the art of timelessness. Shabbat is more than an armistice. It is the profound harmony between man and the universe, the affinity of all things, and the participation of spirit that unites that existing above with that below. We think generally of the earth as our mother. In our mother's civilization, time is money, and success is our companion. The 7th day reminds us that God is our Father, that time is light, and that spirit is our companion. We have combined in our culture a romantic conception of adoration and love that combines myth and passion so that it dominates man and has produced the weak spirit of Western man. The Jewish contribution to the idea of love is the conception of love of Shabbat, the love of the day, the spirit in time. This was taught by Jonah's friend in Capernaum, which was also the place where Jesus preached in the synagogue in his early days. In Zaphod, one of the Kabbalistic cities in the north, we also stayed overnight with some friends of Jonah's. Since Jonah did not have to work the next morning, he took me to a large temple in the middle of the city. There we met with a rabbi, a bearded Hasidic man in his 70s. The rabbi spoke to me in English, and after relatively little introduction, he asked me, "Do you know Davin?" I didn't answer him right away because I was transfixed by how much he reminded me of my grandfather. Looking at and hearing the rabbi took me back to a time when I saw my grandfather praying. The daven, I said, searching through my memory for the many prayers my grandfather had taught me. Jonah explained the rabbi was talking about a type of prayer that involves the shaking or vibration of the body. Ah, yes, I replied. I learned a similar Sufi meditation performed in a circle called the Hazrat. The daven is also performed in a circle, the rabbi smiled broadly. We repeated a prayer or mantra over and over during the Hazrat, I said. Do you have something like that? The rabbi asked Jonah for a clarification of the word mantra, and upon hearing Jonah's explanation in Hebrew, he broke into a quiet laugh. Yes, the rabbi said. The daven is not practiced very much anymore, so there are few who know the chant that goes with it to bring the Holy Spirit into the body. We say, Rabbona Shel Olam. I didn't understand the phrase immediately. When I asked Jonah about it later on the drive back down to Jerusalem, he explained that the pronunciation was Hasidic and pronounced it for me in standard Hebrew. Then I understood that the translation was similar to the one of the Sufi zikrs I often used, Master of the Universe. Rabbi, I asked, can you tell me the basis of your tradition? I have studied Sufism, and you seem to incorporate many of the same rituals. I'm always happy to share our history with a seeker, the rabbi responded. The philosophers can only surmise what exists in the metaphysical realm, while the Kabbalist can actually see it. The most important system we utilize involves the pronunciation of the divine name. I was amazed at the similarities of the Sufis and this esoteric Hebrew tradition. Safed is a famous Kabbalah academy city, the rabbi continued. It has been so since the 15th century. Before that time, Kabbalistic traditions existed, but they were not very powerful. 3 events in the late 1400s gave rise to its influence. The first was the printing of the Gutenberg Bible, and by 1475, the printing of the first Hebrew book. The second was the discovery of America by Columbus. This discovery changed man's view of the world, and as a result, many earlier philosophies had to be re-examined, causing the philosophical schools that had opposed the Kabbalistic knowledge to be significantly weakened. The third was the Spanish Inquisition, which brought the Jews out of Spain and made them migrate to Safed, bringing the synthesis of the Islamic and the Christian, the Jewish knowledge to this town. It was a renaissance, exactly half a millennium ago. A radical transformation occurred, a reconnection of the soul. We live in a time of a similar shift in spiritual awakening on the planet. Yet there is a difference. It is now on a massive scale. The last thing the rabbi said to me was, all religions come from basic spiritual experiences that turn into ritual to maintain the experience, but then end up an ideological belief system that is removed from the experience. I am Jewish, but I am not dogmatic. I know there are many things to be learned from other traditions. A man who truly reaches enlightenment, regardless of the path he follows, will discover that there are other roads leading to the place of God. It is the followers that desecrate the experience through fundamentalism. I thought about what the rabbi said in terms of world crises. Because there is such a strong need for community, people are becoming xenophobic. Because there is such a strong need for spirituality, people become fundamentalist and fanatic. Because there is so much need for stability, there is a threat of authoritarianism. There is a fine line between authority of the soul that gives stability to an individual and authoritarianism which leads to tyranny. Just as freedom of thought and democracy go hand in hand, so too freedom of spiritual expression and experience goes hand in hand with holistic living. We are not Jews or Christians or Sufis or Muslims. We are human beings with a divine connection. These labels are merely the traditions that we follow, and these traditions come to the same conclusion. The sacredness is in all. God is in all. One Friday, Jonah and I were in Nazareth, the birthplace of Jesus. Jonah again had some work to do while we were there, but he said that it should only take half the day, and then he would show me around. Jonah suggested that I explore the area while he was at work, so that when he had finished with his work, we would go back to anything I wanted to investigate in depth. I had set out on my own to find a church supposedly built on the site where Jesus was born. I was in an Arab neighborhood of the city headed toward the church when I had a vision of a man with long hair in white robes walking along the street ahead of me. The vision was so clear, I thought not only that it was a real person, but that it was definitely Jesus. My heart burst wide open, and I felt connected to him by a ray of light coming from his chest. At first we stood face to face. Then he turned, and I followed him down the street, trying to get his attention. It was all very vivid, like going into a parallel universe in which the street was there, but I was also in another dimension, walking after him. He turned right down a narrow alley, and I followed after him. As I turned the corner into the alley, I saw the figure was getting too far away, and I shouted, "Rabbi," to get his attention. He disappeared down another alley to the left. When I turned and looked to the left, down this darker, narrower alley, the white-robed figure was gone. There was a young boy sitting in a doorway on the left, however. As I approached the boy, he called to me in English, "You're looking for him?" He went that way. He pointed further down the alley. I continued down the alley until I came to a dead end. At the end was a small, old wooden door. I stood there a moment, considering what to do. Just then, a woman came out to the door and shouted at me in English, "Get out! This is private property." I pointed back down the alley where I had spoken with the young boy. "Excuse me, but the child over there told me that a man in white robes had come this way, and I was trying to find him." "You're lying," the woman shouted. "That boy doesn't speak any English." I apologized for disturbing her and headed back down the alley. I felt certain I had been here before, but it was many years later before I found out where I had been. As I came upon the young boy again, I said, "The woman at the end of the alley told me I couldn't go in." The boy looked up at me with a puzzled expression and said something to me in Arabic that I couldn't understand. I walked away bewildered, knowing something profound had happened, but not knowing exactly what it was. For my last days in Israel, before returning to the United States, I ventured alone into Jerusalem. I had heard of a famous Jewish school, or yeshiva, there, where students were preparing for the coming of the Messiah. I had wondered how similar this messianic consciousness was to the prophecies of the South American Indians I had encountered earlier. When I got to the yeshiva, there were many Orthodox Jewish men of various ages, scurrying about with huge books and scrolls under their arms. An older bald man, wearing a white yarmulke and thick glasses, was sitting at a desk facing the front door. So I went up to him and asked if I could see the head rabbi. "I'm sorry," the man at the desk said, "but Rabbi Cohen doesn't speak to anyone other than the fourth-year students enrolled here. Perhaps I could find one of the other rabbis to answer your questions." "I think Rabbi might be interested in seeing me," I said. "I've been studying. Rabbi Cohen is the son of Rabbi Kook. Rabbi Kook was the head rabbi of Jerusalem. Our rabbi does not even receive heads of state." "Would you just tell him that a doctor from Chile is here and would like to find out more about his preparations for the coming of the Messiah. The man at the desk stared at me for a minute. With a raised eyebrow, he got up from his desk and said, "I will tell the rabbi you're here, but he won't have time to see you." He trudged off down the hallway and through the double doors at the end. 2 minutes later, he returned with his mouth hanging open a bit. "The rabbi will see you," he said, as he motioned for me to go down to the room at the end of the hall. When I entered the room, I made my way through a small, staring crowd of men about my age near the door. At the opposite end of the room, on a raised platform, sat a man in his late 80s. His peaceful and joyful gaze and long white beard reminded me of the descriptions I had read of the Baal Shem Tov, the father of Hasidism. When our eyes met, the elderly rabbi rose from his chair and embraced me. He looked into my eyes again and said, "Ahava," the Hebrew word for love. He grabbed my hands and started dancing with me around the room, singing the word Ahava over and over. After a couple of minutes of this, the rabbi sat down in the chair again to catch his breath. One of his students, who had been watching this unusual display, came up to me and asked me in English, "The rabbi sleeps and eats and teaches in this room. He does not speak except to lead the prayers. How come he is so happy and dancing?" "I don't know," I said honestly. The rabbi called to one of his students and briefly said something to him that I couldn't hear. The rabbi beckoned me to come closer, so I did. He whispered something else to the young man, who then turned to me and said, "The rabbi says that he has something to teach that he is sure will benefit you." With this student translating into English, I heard the following from the rabbi. When a person sets his mind on something, its essence returns to him. Therefore, if you wish to pray or to grasp the true nature of an idea, do the following. Imagine that you yourself are light, and that all of your surroundings on every side are also light. And in the middle of this light is a throne of light. Above the throne is a light called the glow, and facing this is another throne. Above the second throne is a light called the good. You are standing between the two. If you wish to take revenge, turn to the glow. If you wish to seek mercy, turn to the good. The words that you speak should be directed toward the light of mercy if you wish to heal. Now turn yourself to the right, and there you will find another light. And that's a brilliant, almost blinding light. To your left, you will see another light called Zohar, the radiant light. Above these two, between them, is a light called glory, and around it is a light called Chaim, or life. I remembered at just that moment the Hebrew name I'd been given as a young child was Chaim. Above it, the student went on translating for the rabbi, is the crown. This is the light that crowns the desires of the mind and illumines the path of the imagination, enhancing the Zohar, the radiance of the vision. This light has no end. It cannot be fathomed. From the glory of its perfection comes desire, blessing, peace, life, and all good to those who keep the way of its unification. The light is hidden from those who stray from the path of this light and are transformed into its exact opposite. The true path is straight. This is the first verse of the Quran, I thought. How unexpected to hear it coming from a Talmudic rabbi. I suddenly remembered several years before, lying in a field in Chile, just after one of my drumming sessions with Don Eduardo, my shaman. The thrones of light Rabbi Kuka Cohen had just described were in one of my visions at that time. I had chosen at that particular point to devote my life to service. Separate your soul from your body, then your soul can be clothed in the thought that is contained in the words you pronounce, your prayer. You will then be able to perceive many universes on high. You have many powers, one acquired for one universe and another for the next. When your soul ascends to all the worlds that you must elevate to, it is examined in each universe to see if it is fit to go higher. The power of concentration is vital, and total attention is needed. When an extraneous thought comes to you, that is a sign that you can be cast out. But if you are wise, you can use that thought itself to bind yourself to God all the more. Your thought consists of ladders that are part of the Divine Presence's body, but they fell as a result of your incarnation. You must understand the idea that you can elevate the thought that falls into your mind. The thought comes from a divine universe. If it involves desire or lust, it has fallen from the universe of love. If it is a debilitating phobia, it is from the universe of fear. If it involves pride, it is from the universe of beauty. You must use the thought to enter the divine universe from which it came. The same is true of all other such thoughts. The attributes that can be used one way can also be transmuted into its opposite. The metaphysical process of transmutation was becoming clear. I understood the importance of the power of not having remorse for the negative, but to instead transform it. This was just like what Otis Jefferson had told me when clearing the past. Take all those negative traits that that little child, the inner child, has inherited, and transmute them into the positive, into the attribute, into the virtue. The same ladder, said the rabbi, reminded me of the Sufi mystic Rumi, that you have used to leave this world is the ladder that you can use to enter another. It depends on the concentration of the individual. He must know how to concentrate on this truth with a combination of thought and desire derived from the real power. And according to the strength of his concentration, he will then transmit power through his desire, desire through his knowledge, imagination through his thoughts, strength through his effort, and fortitude into the infinite contemplation. As Jonah drove me back to the airport in Tel Aviv the next morning, I described for him this meeting with Rabbi Kuka Cohen. He listened quietly as he drove, responding only with nods of his head. When I had finished, he asked me, "Carlos, you have seen much of the Holy Land. Is there anything you think I missed?" "No," I answered. "You have been a wonderful guide." "You never told me what happened in Nazareth on Friday. What did you do for the 3 hours you were on your own?" "I was just walking around," I said. Jonah must have decided to let it pass, because he didn't ask me further about what happened. I was relieved, because I didn't feel like discussing it. Although I felt fairly comfortable with this Swiss bee expert, I wasn't sure how accepting he would be of what I encountered in Nazareth.